My daughter-in-law, a bank manager, humiliated me in public just because I asked to withdraw $80. She smirked. We don't serve people from the gutter here. Minutes later, I made a request for $260,000. The entire bank stood up. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Michael, and at 63 years old, I thought I had seen the worst of human nature. I was wrong. It was a Tuesday morning in October when I walked into First National Bank, the same branch where I had been banking for over 20 years. The autumn air was crisp, and I wore my usual outfit, a worn flannel shirt, faded jeans, and the work boots I had owned for nearly a decade. They were comfortable, familiar, like old friends that had walked with me through countless days. I needed to withdraw $80 for groceries and my weekly visit to the barber. Nothing fancy, just enough to get by for the week. As I approached the teller counter, I noticed a familiar face behind the manager's desk. Rebecca, my daughter-in-law, sat there reviewing some paperwork, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her navy business suit crisp and professional. She looked up and saw me. For a moment, our eyes met, and I expected at least a polite nod of acknowledgement. Instead, she quickly looked away, as if she hadn't seen me at all. I felt a small knot form in my stomach, but I pushed it aside. Maybe she was just busy. I waited in line behind two other customers, shifting my weight from one foot to the other. The bank felt different somehow, colder, more impersonal than I remembered. When my turn came, I approached the young teller with a smile. "Good morning," I said, pulling out my worn leather wallet. "I'd like to withdraw $80 from my checking account, please." The teller, a girl who couldn't have been more than 25, looked at me with barely concealed disdain. She glanced over at Rebecca's desk, then back at me. "ID and bank card, please." I handed over my documents, noticing how she handled them as if they might contaminate her perfectly manicured nails. She typed something into her computer, frowned, then typed some more. "Sir, your account shows a balance of..." She paused, looking at the screen with confusion. "Well, it shows you have sufficient funds, but I need to get manager approval for this transaction." "For $80? I asked, genuinely puzzled. I've been banking here for over 20 years. Without waiting for my response, she called out loudly, "Rebecca, I need manager approval for this customer." The entire bank seemed to go quiet. Other customers turned to look at me, their expressions ranging from curiosity to judgment. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment as Rebecca slowly stood up from her desk, smoothing her skirt as she walked over. When she reached the counter, she didn't look at me directly. Instead, she spoke to the teller as if I wasn't standing right there. "What's the issue, Jennifer?" "This gentleman wants to withdraw $80, but given his appearance and the unusual activity on the account, I thought you should handle it." Rebecca finally looked at me then, and what I saw in her eyes made my heart sink. It wasn't just indifference. It was disgust, as if I were something unpleasant she had stepped in. "Oh," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the bank lobby. "It's my father-in-law." The way she said it, you would have thought she was announcing the presence of a cockroach. Several customers turned to stare, their conversations dying mid-sentence. I felt every eye in that bank boring into me, judging me, finding me wanting. Rebecca crossed her arms and looked me up and down, her gaze lingering on my worn boots and faded clothes. Then, with a smile that never reached her eyes, she delivered the words that would haunt me for days. "We don't serve people from the gutter here," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "Perhaps you should try the check-cashing place down the street. They're more accommodating to people of your circumstances." The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, my wallet still in my hand, feeling as if the floor had disappeared beneath my feet. In that moment, I wasn't a man who had worked hard his entire life, who had raised a family, who had built something meaningful with his bare hands. I was just an old man in shabby clothes, being publicly humiliated by his own daughter-in-law. I could hear whispers starting around me. Poor old man. How embarrassing. She's right, though. Look at him. My throat felt tight, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I might cry right there in front of everyone. The young teller was trying hard not to smile, clearly enjoying the show. Other bank employees had stopped what they were doing to watch. Rebecca stood there with her arms still crossed, waiting for me to leave. Her expression was one of smug satisfaction, as if she had just solved an unpleasant problem. In her eyes, I could see what my own son's wife really thought of me, that I was nothing more than an embarrassment, a burden, someone to be tolerated at best. I carefully put my wallet back in my pocket, my hands steadier than I felt inside. I looked at Rebecca one last time, memorizing her face, the coldness in her eyes, the way she held herself like she was so much better than me. "Thank you for clarifying your position," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. Then I turned and walked toward the exit, feeling the weight of every stare, every whisper, every judgment. My legs felt heavy, and each step seemed to echo in the sudden quiet of the bank lobby. As I pushed through the glass doors and stepped back into the October morning, I took a deep breath of the cool air. The knot in my stomach had grown into something larger, something that pressed against my chest and made it hard to breathe normally. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching people walk by, going about their normal lives. None of them knew what had just happened inside that bank. None of them knew that a son's wife had just stripped away the last of an old man's dignity in front of strangers. But as I stood there, something began to shift inside me. The hurt was still there, sharp and raw, but underneath it something else was growing, something that had been sleeping for a very long time. Rebecca had made a mistake today, a big one. She thought she knew who I was. She thought she understood what I represented. But she had only seen what I wanted her to see, what I had carefully chosen to show the world. As I walked slowly back to my old pickup truck, I couldn't help but smile just a little. In a few days, I would return to that bank. And when I did, Rebecca was going to learn something about making assumptions. The drive home from the bank felt longer than usual. My hands gripped the steering wheel of my 1998 Ford pickup, a truck that had seen better days but still ran like a dream. The faded blue paint and rust spots told a story of years of honest work, of hauling lumber and tools, of being a reliable companion through decades of early mornings and late nights. As I pulled into my driveway, I looked at my house, a modest two-story home with white siding that needed a fresh coat of paint. The lawn was neatly trimmed, the garden well tended, but nothing about it screamed wealth or success. Just like everything else in my life, it was designed to blend in, to not draw attention. I sat in my truck for a few minutes after turning off the engine, still processing what had happened at the bank. Rebecca's words echoed in my mind. "We don't serve people from the gutter here." The contempt in her voice, the satisfaction in her eyes as she humiliated me in front of strangers. She had no idea who she was talking to. Walking into my house, I made my way to the small office I kept in the back bedroom. It was a simple room with a desk, a file cabinet, and a computer that was older than most smartphones. But inside that file cabinet were documents that told a very different story than the one Rebecca thought she knew. I pulled out a folder labeled Property Holdings and spread the contents across my desk. Deeds, mortgage papers, investment statements, pieces of a puzzle that very few people had ever seen put together. The first property I had bought was a small duplex back in 1981. I was 24 years old then, married to my late wife Sarah, with our son David just learning to walk. We were living paycheck to paycheck. But I had noticed something about that duplex. It was in a neighborhood that the city had earmarked for development, though most people didn't know it yet. I remembered the night I told Sarah about my plan to buy it. We were sitting at our kitchen table, surrounded by bills and baby toys, trying to figure out how to make ends meet. "Michael, we can barely afford this apartment," she had said, her voice tired but patient. "How can we possibly buy a whole building?" "Trust me on this one, sweetheart," I had replied, taking her hand across the table. "I've been watching the city council meetings. I know which way this neighborhood is heading." She did trust me, bless her heart. We scraped together every penny we had for the down payment, and I took on a second job, driving a delivery truck on weekends to make the mortgage payments. For 2 years we lived on ramen noodles and store-brand everything, but we made it work. When the city announced the new shopping complex going in 3 blocks away, property values in our neighborhood doubled almost overnight. We sold that duplex and bought 2 more properties with the profit. That was the beginning. Over the next 4 decades, I had quietly built a real estate portfolio that stretched across 3 states, always buying properties that others overlooked, always seeing potential where others saw problems. I reinvested every profit, lived modestly, and watched my investments grow. Sarah understood what we were building together. She never needed designer clothes or fancy cars. She was happy with our simple life, knowing that we were securing our future and David's future with every smart decision we made. When she passed away 5 years ago from cancer, I thought David would appreciate the sacrifices his mother and I had made. I thought he would understand the value of living below your means, of building something lasting instead of showing off. Instead, he married Rebecca. I pulled out another folder, this one containing bank statements and investment portfolios. Numbers that would make most people's eyes widen in disbelief. Real estate wasn't my only venture over the years. I had quietly invested in small businesses, bought stock in companies before they became household names, and put money into opportunities that others were too proud or too impatient to consider. The irony wasn't lost on me. Rebecca worked at a bank, surrounded by money every day, making decisions about other people's financial lives. Yet she had completely misjudged the quiet old man who came in wearing work boots and asking for $80. I thought about the early years of David and Rebecca's marriage, how she had slowly changed him, convinced him that success meant showing off, that worth was measured by appearances. David started buying expensive clothes, leasing luxury cars he couldn't afford, moving into an apartment that stretched their budget to the breaking point. When they came to family dinners, I would watch Rebecca's eyes constantly scanning my house, her expression clearly disappointed by what she saw. She never said anything directly, but her body language spoke volumes. The way she avoided sitting on my old couch. The way she barely touched the food I cooked. The way she looked at her phone constantly, as if she had somewhere more important to be. David started changing too. My son, who used to help me with home repairs and enjoyed our quiet conversations about life, became distant. He started making comments about me needing to live a little, suggesting I should buy a new car or update my wardrobe. "Dad, you have to think about your image," he had said during one of our last real conversations. "People judge you by how you present yourself." What he didn't understand was that I had been very carefully crafting my image for decades. I wanted people to underestimate me. I wanted them to see an ordinary working man who posed no threat, who wasn't worth paying attention to. It made business easier, negotiations simpler, and life more peaceful. But it also meant that my own family had started to see me the same way everyone else did. I put the financial documents back in their folders and pulled out one more file. This one contained correspondence with my lawyer about my will and estate planning. For years I had planned to leave everything to David, trusting that he would use the inheritance wisely and maybe understand finally what his parents had built together. But lately, I had been reconsidering that decision. Sitting there in my quiet office, looking at the proof of 4 decades of careful planning and smart investments, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: clarity. The humiliation at the bank hadn't broken me. It had awakened something. Rebecca thought she knew who I was. She thought she understood my value, my worth, my place in the world. She had made her judgment based on my clothes, my car, my quiet demeanor. She was about to learn how wrong she was. I opened my laptop and logged into my primary bank account. Not the small checking account I used for daily expenses, but the one where I kept my real money. The balance that appeared on the screen was the result of 42 years of disciplined investing, careful planning, and living below my means. It was time for Rebecca to meet the real Michael, but I wasn't going to simply tell her who I was. That would be too easy, too forgettable. I was going to show her. And when I did, she would understand that humiliating people has consequences, that judging others by their appearance is a dangerous game, that sometimes the quiet old man in worn clothes is exactly the person you should treat with respect. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, feeling calmer than I had in days. Rebecca had started something today that she couldn't finish, but I could. 3 days had passed since the incident at the bank, and I hadn't been able to get Rebecca's words out of my head, not because they hurt, though they did, but because they had crystallized something I had been feeling for months. My own family saw me as a burden, a relic from a simpler time who didn't understand how the modern world worked. It was Friday morning when I made my decision. I was sitting at my kitchen table, drinking coffee from the same ceramic mug I had used for the past 15 years, when the plan came to me with perfect clarity. I wasn't going to confront Rebecca with angry words or dramatic revelations. I wasn't going to call David and complain about his wife's behavior. Instead, I was going to give her exactly what she thought she wanted, a chance to demonstrate her superiority over the old man from the gutter. But I was also going to show her something that would change everything she thought she knew about power, about money, and about the consequences of judging people by their appearance. I drove back to First National Bank at exactly 10:30 in the morning, the same time I had arrived 3 days earlier. I wore the same clothes, The faded jeans, the worn flannel shirt, the work boots that had seen better days. Everything about my appearance said I was exactly who Rebecca thought I was, a working-class man of modest means who probably lived paycheck to paycheck. The bank was busier than it had been on Tuesday. Friday mornings always brought more customers, more activity, more witnesses to whatever was about to unfold. I joined the line, standing patiently behind a woman in a business suit who kept checking her watch and sighing impatiently. Rebecca was at her desk again, talking on the phone with someone about loan applications. She glanced up and saw me standing in line, and I watched her expression change from neutral professionalism to something approaching annoyance. She said something quick into the phone and hung up, then spoke quietly to Jennifer, the young teller who had been working 3 days ago. When my turn came, I approached Jennifer's window with the same polite smile I always wore. "Good morning," I said, placing my hands on the counter. "I need to make a transfer today." Jennifer looked at me with the same barely concealed disdain she had shown before. "What kind of transfer, sir?" "I need to move some funds from my savings account to my checking account. $260,000, please." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Jennifer blinked, certain she had misheard me. The customer behind me stopped shuffling papers. Even the security guard near the door turned to look. "I'm sorry, sir, did you say?" Jennifer's voice trailed off. $260,000, I repeated calmly. "From savings to checking. I assume that won't be a problem?" Jennifer's face went pale. She stared at her computer screen, then at me, then back at the screen. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed in my account information. What happened next was exactly what I had expected, but somehow more satisfying than I had imagined. Jennifer's eyes went wide as the account information populated on her screen. She blinked several times, as if the numbers might change if she looked hard enough. Then she swallowed hard and glanced toward Rebecca's desk. "Ma'am," she called out, her voice higher than normal. "I need immediate manager assistance." The bank seemed to shift around us. Conversations quieted. Other tellers stopped what they were doing. Rebecca stood up from her desk, smoothing her skirt as she had 3 days earlier. But this time her expression was different. She looked confused, almost worried. "What's the issue now, Jennifer?" Rebecca asked as she approached the counter. Jennifer leaned close to her manager and whispered something I couldn't hear, but I could see Rebecca's face change as the words sank in. Her confident posture faltered. The color drained from her cheeks. Rebecca looked at me then, really looked at me, as if seeing me for the first time. Gone was the contemptuous dismissal from Tuesday. In its place was something I hadn't seen from her before: uncertainty. "Sir," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "Jennifer tells me you want to transfer a substantial amount. I'll need to verify your identity and account information personally." "Of course," I replied, pulling out my wallet with the same deliberate calm I had maintained throughout this entire exchange. "I understand that large transactions require additional oversight." Rebecca took my ID and bank card with hands that weren't quite steady. She walked back to her desk and began typing, her movements quick and nervous. I could see her checking and double-checking the information on her screen. Meanwhile, word was spreading through the bank. Other employees were glancing in my direction. The branch manager had emerged from his office and was watching from a distance. Customers were starting to whisper among themselves. After what felt like 10 minutes but was probably only 3, Rebecca returned to the counter. Her professional composure was back in place, but I could see the strain around her eyes. "Mr. Coleman," she said, using my last name for the first time in years, "your account information checks out. However, a transfer of this magnitude requires additional documentation and approvals. Would you mind stepping over to my desk so we can complete this transaction privately?" The irony was delicious. 3 days ago she had been eager to handle my business as publicly as possible, making sure everyone in the bank could witness my humiliation. Now she wanted privacy, discretion, a chance to contain whatever was happening. "I'm comfortable handling this here at the counter," I said pleasantly, "unless there's some reason the transaction can't be completed." Rebecca's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "No, sir. No reason at all." She returned to her computer and began the process of moving $260,000 from one of my accounts to another. With each keystroke, I could see her growing more uncomfortable, more aware that she had fundamentally misjudged the situation. But what Rebecca didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this was just the beginning. The $260,000 I was moving represented less than 2% of my total liquid assets. It was pocket change, a small demonstration designed to get their attention. As the transaction processed, I watched the other bank employees trying to pretend they weren't watching. I saw customers straining to overhear our conversation. I felt the shift in the atmosphere as people began to reassess the quiet old man in work clothes. When the transfer was complete, Rebecca printed out a receipt and handed it to me. Her hand brushed mine briefly, and I could feel how cold her fingers were. "Is there anything else I can help you with today, Mr. Coleman?" she asked, her voice professionally polite but strained. "Not today," I replied, folding the receipt and putting it in my wallet, "but I'll probably be back early next week. I have some other financial matters to attend to." I turned to leave, then paused and looked back at her. "Oh, and Rebecca, you might want to review your customer service policies. Sometimes people aren't exactly what they appear to be." As I walked toward the exit, I could feel every eye in the bank following me. The same people who had witnessed my humiliation 3 days earlier were now watching in stunned silence as the narrative completely reversed itself. I pushed through the glass doors and stepped back into the autumn air, feeling lighter than I had in months. The first phase of my plan was complete. Rebecca now knew that I had access to serious money, but she still had no idea how serious. More importantly, she was starting to understand that she had made an enemy, not through anger or spite, but through her own arrogance and cruelty. As I climbed into my old pickup truck, I allowed myself a small smile. Rebecca thought today's transaction was significant. She thought $260,000 was impressive. She had no idea what was coming next. The weekend passed slowly, but I used the time wisely. Saturday morning, I called my lawyer, Harold Morrison, who had been handling my legal affairs for over 20 years. Harold was one of the few people who knew the full scope of my financial situation, and he had always been discreet about it. "Michael," he said when he answered the phone, "I was just thinking about you. How are things?" "Complicated," I replied, settling into my desk chair. "I need you to look into something for me. It involves my daughter-in-law." I explained what had happened at the bank, both the humiliation on Tuesday and my response on Friday. Harold listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of understanding or disapproval. "What exactly do you want me to investigate?" he asked when I finished. "Rebecca works at First National Bank as a manager. I want to know if she's been accessing my account information inappropriately. I also want to know if she's shared any of my financial details with David or anyone else in the family." Harold was quiet for a moment. "That would be a serious breach of banking regulations if she has. Are you thinking of filing a complaint?" "Maybe," I said. "But first I want to know exactly what she's done and when she did it. I'll reach out to some contacts on Monday. Banking records are protected, but there are ways to determine if someone has been accessing accounts they shouldn't be looking at." After I hung up with Harold, I spent the rest of Saturday thinking about my family dynamics over the past few years. When had David started changing? When had the distance between us really begun? Looking back, I could pinpoint it to about 6 months after he married Rebecca. Before that, David would come by every few weeks, help me with projects around the house, ask for advice about work or life. We had the kind of relationship I had always hoped to have with my son. But gradually, those visits became less frequent. Our conversations became shorter, more superficial. David started making comments about my lifestyle, suggesting I should spend more money on myself, acting embarrassed by my simple way of living. At the time, I had attributed it to the normal evolution of a young man starting his own family. But now I wondered if there had been more deliberate influence at work. Sunday morning, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called David. "Hey, Dad," he answered, sounding surprised. "How are you doing?" "I'm fine, son. I was wondering if you and Rebecca might want to come over for dinner this week. It's been a while since we've all sat down together." There was a pause. I could hear Rebecca's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. "Actually, Dad, this week is pretty busy for us. Rebecca's got some big projects at work, and I'm putting in overtime on the Henderson account. Maybe we could do something next month." Next month. It was always next month with them. "Of course," I said. "How are things going at the bank for Rebecca?" She seemed stressed when I saw her there on Friday. Another pause, longer this time. "You went to her bank?" "Dad, you know that makes her uncomfortable. She's trying to maintain professional boundaries." "Professional boundaries? as if acknowledging her father-in-law was some kind of ethical violation. I understand, I replied. I just needed to handle some banking business, nothing personal. Right, well, maybe you could use a different branch next time. Rebecca works really hard to build respect at that place, and having family members come in asking for special treatment doesn't help her image. Special treatment, is that what he thought had happened? I'll keep that in mind, I said. Give my love to Rebecca. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring out at my backyard. The conversation had confirmed what I suspected. Rebecca had told David her version of what happened at the bank, and it wasn't the truth. Monday morning, Harold called me back with information that made my blood run cold. Michael, you're not going to like this, he said without preamble. My contact at the State Banking Commission pulled some records. Rebecca has been accessing your account information regularly for the past 18 months. I felt my grip tighten on the phone. How regularly? Monthly, sometimes more often. She's been checking your balances, transaction history, everything. And Michael, she's only been looking at your small checking account, the one you use for daily expenses. She has no idea about your other accounts. The pieces were falling into place. Rebecca had been spying on my finances, but she had only seen part of the picture. Based on the limited information she had access to, she had concluded that I was barely getting by financially. There's more, Harold continued. She's also run credit checks on you multiple times, and she's accessed account information for several other family members. Your cousin Martha, your nephew James, even your late wife's sister Helen. I felt sick. Is that legal? Absolutely not. It's a federal crime. Banks have strict protocols about when and why employees can access customer information. Personal curiosity and family gossip don't qualify as legitimate business purposes. So she's been building a financial profile of our entire family. That's exactly what it looks like. And Michael, based on the timing of these searches, I think she's been sharing this information with others. The searches often happen right before family gatherings or holidays. I thought about the past year and a half, how conversations at family dinners had started, including subtle comments about money. How relatives would make offhand remarks about who was doing well financially and who was struggling. How David had started treating me like I needed financial advice or help managing my affairs. Rebecca hadn't just been violating my privacy. She had been manipulating my entire family's perception of me, using privileged information to create a narrative that served her purposes. What are my options? I asked Harold. You could file a criminal complaint. With this much evidence, the Banking Commission would have to investigate. Rebecca would almost certainly lose her job and face serious legal consequences. And what would that accomplish? Justice? Harold suggested. She broke the law, Michael. She violated your trust and your privacy in the worst possible way. I thought about it for a moment. Let me ask you something else. If I wanted to transfer a significant amount of money into that checking account, the one she's been monitoring, would that show up on her next search? Harold chuckled. Oh, it would definitely show up. Any large deposits or transfers generate automatic alerts in their system. She'd know about it within hours. How much money are we talking about to really get someone's attention? At a small branch bank like First National, anything over $50,000 would be noticed. $1 million would stop them in their tracks. I smiled for the first time since this whole ordeal began. Harold, I want you to prepare documents for a significant financial transfer, and I want you to document everything Rebecca has done, but don't file any complaints yet. I want to handle this my way first. Michael, what are you planning? I'm planning to give Rebecca exactly what she's been looking for. Complete access to my financial information, all of it. Harold was quiet for a long moment. You realize that once you do this, there's no going back. Your whole family is going to know about your wealth. Good, I said. It's time they learned who they've really been dealing with. Tuesday morning, I dressed in my usual clothes and drove to the bank one more time. But this visit was different. This time, I wasn't just making a point. This time, I was changing everything. Tuesday morning arrived with an unusual phone call. It was David, and he sounded agitated in a way I hadn't heard in years. Dad, we need to talk. Can you come over tonight? Rebecca will be home from work around 7. Of course, son. Is everything all right? Just come over. We'll explain everything when you get here. I knew exactly what had prompted this sudden invitation. The previous afternoon, I had walked into First National Bank and transferred $4.2 million from my primary investment account into the small checking account that Rebecca had been monitoring for 18 months. Harold had been right. A transfer of that magnitude would have triggered immediate alerts throughout the bank system. Rebecca would have seen it within hours. I spent the day quietly preparing for what I knew would be the most important conversation of my relationship with my son. I pulled together copies of financial documents, property deeds, and investment statements, not to boast, but to provide context for what had really been happening in our family. At exactly 7 o'clock, I knocked on the door of David and Rebecca's apartment. It was a nice place, though I knew they struggled to afford the rent. David opened the door and I could see the confusion and uncertainty in his eyes. "Dad, come in. Rebecca's in the living room." I followed him inside, noticing how different the atmosphere felt compared to my previous visits. Usually there was a tension in the air, a sense that I was an unwelcome intrusion into their sophisticated life. Tonight, that tension had been replaced by something else entirely. Rebecca was sitting on their leather couch, still wearing her work clothes. Her usually perfect composure was cracked, and she looked like someone who had received shocking news and hadn't quite processed it yet. "Hello, Rebecca," I said politely, taking a seat in the chair across from her. She stared at me for a long moment before speaking. "Michael, I think there's been some kind of mistake with your bank account." "What kind of mistake?" David sat down next to his wife, leaning forward with his hands clasped. "Dad, Rebecca saw that you deposited over $4 million yesterday. That can't be right, can it? Is someone using your account for money laundering or something?" I almost smiled at his innocence. Even faced with evidence of my wealth, his first assumption was that something illegal must be happening. "No money laundering, son. That was a legitimate transfer from one of my investment accounts." Rebecca's face went pale. "One of your investment accounts? How many accounts do you have?" "Several," I replied calmly. "I've been investing for over 40 years. It tends to add up." The silence that followed was profound. I could see both of them trying to process this information, trying to reconcile it with their understanding of who I was. David was the first to speak. "Dad, if you have that kind of money, why do you live the way you do? Why drive that old truck? Why wear those clothes?" "Because material possessions don't define worth, David. Your mother and I learned that early in our marriage. We built wealth to create security and options, not to impress people." Rebecca finally found her voice. "But you asked for $80 last week. Why would someone with millions of dollars need to withdraw such a small amount?" I looked at her directly, letting the weight of my gaze settle on her. "Rebecca, I think you know exactly why I was at your bank last week, and I think you know exactly what you said to me." Her face flushed red. "I was just doing my job. Bank security requires us to be cautious about unusual customers." "Unusual customers?" I repeated. "Is that what you call your own father-in-law?" David looked between us, clearly sensing undercurrents he didn't understand. "What happened at the bank?" "Rebecca said you came in acting strange and made everyone uncomfortable." I reached into my jacket and pulled out a small digital recorder that Harold had given me. "David, before we continue this conversation, I want you to hear something." Rebecca's eyes went wide. "What is that?" "It's a recording device. Harold suggested I start carrying one to protect myself in situations where people might misrepresent what actually happened." I pressed play, and Rebecca's voice filled the room. "We don't serve people from the gutter here. Perhaps you should try the check cashing place down the street. They're more accommodating to people of your circumstances." The color drained completely from David's face. He turned to look at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. "Rebecca, you said that to my father." Rebecca's composure finally cracked completely. "David, you don't understand. He looked like a homeless person. He was embarrassing me in front of my co-workers and customers. I was trying to maintain professional standards." "Professional standards?" I interjected. "Is that what you call it when you illegally access customer account information to spy on your own family?" Both David and Rebecca froze. The accusation hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. "What are you talking about?" David asked. I pulled out a folder that Harold had prepared and set it on the coffee table between us. "Rebecca has been accessing my bank records for 18 months without authorization. She's also been checking the financial information of other family members. It's a federal crime." Rebecca's hands started shaking. I had legitimate business reasons." "What business reasons?" I asked calmly. "What legitimate bank business required you to check my account balance every month? What business purpose was served by running credit checks on my sister-in-law and my nephew? David picked up the folder and started reading through the documentation Harold had compiled. With each page, his expression grew darker. "Rebecca, this shows you accessed Dad's account 43 times in the past year and a half. 43 times. And you've been looking at Martha's information, and James's, and Helen's." "I can explain," Rebecca said desperately. "I was trying to protect our family. I wanted to know if anyone was taking advantage of you financially. I was trying to help." "Help?" I asked. "By telling family members that I was struggling financially? By spreading stories about my personal business? By convincing my own son that I needed financial advice and assistance?" David was staring at his wife with a mixture of shock and disgust. "Is that true? Have you been telling people about Dad's finances?" Rebecca's silence was answer enough. I leaned forward in my chair. "David, for the past 18 months, your wife has been using privileged information to manipulate how our family sees me. She convinced everyone that I was barely getting by financially, that I was out of touch and needed guidance. She turned me into a charity case in the eyes of my own relatives." "But why?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Control," I replied. As long as everyone believed I was struggling, Rebecca could position herself as the successful, sophisticated one. She could be the voice of reason, the one who understood how money and social status worked. She could slowly push me to the margins of our family. Rebecca stood up suddenly, pacing to the window. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under at that bank. I work with wealthy clients every day. I see how they live, how they dress, how they present themselves. And then my father-in-law shows up looking like he just came from a construction site, asking for grocery money. It reflects on me professionally. So you decided to humiliate me publicly to protect your image?" She spun around, tears streaming down her face. "I never meant for it to go that far. I just wanted you to understand that appearances matter, that you were holding David back by association." David stood up slowly, his face pale with anger. "Holding me back? Rebecca, he's my father. A father who dresses like a day laborer and drives a truck older than our marriage," she shot back. "Do you know what my colleagues say when they find out I'm related to him?" The room went completely silent. Even Rebecca seemed to realize she had gone too far. I stood up and gathered my papers. "Rebecca, you've shown me exactly who you are. You've also shown David who you are. I think my work here is done." As I walked toward the door, David called after me. "Dad, wait. What happens now?" I turned back to face my son. "Now you have to decide what kind of man you want to be, David. What kind of marriage you want to have. What kind of family you want to build." I looked at Rebecca one last time. "As for you, Rebecca, you might want to start looking for a new job. Federal banking violations tend to have serious consequences." As I left their apartment, I could hear them arguing behind me, their voices rising in anger and recrimination. I felt no satisfaction in their pain, but I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete clarity about where I stood with my family. The truth was finally out in the open. Now everyone would have to live with the consequences of their choices. 6 months have passed since that confrontation in David and Rebecca's apartment, and the ripple effects continue to reshape everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and the true nature of the people closest to us. Rebecca lost her job at First National Bank 3 weeks after our conversation. The federal investigation that Harold helped initiate found evidence of systematic privacy violations affecting dozens of customers over a 2-year period. She was terminated immediately and faced federal charges that resulted in a plea agreement, probation, and permanent exclusion from the banking industry. David filed for divorce 2 months later. The dissolution of their marriage wasn't pretty. Rebecca fought for spousal support, claiming she had given up career opportunities to support David's advancement. She demanded half of everything they owned together, which wasn't much since most of their lifestyle had been funded by credit cards and loans they could barely afford. What she didn't know, what David hadn't told her, was that 3 years earlier, I had quietly paid off his student loans. $43,000 that would have taken him years to repay. I had done it anonymously, through a lawyer, because I wanted my son to start his marriage without the burden of debt. I had asked David never to mention it to Rebecca, because I didn't want it to become a source of family drama. When this information came out during the divorce proceedings, Rebecca's lawyer tried to argue that I had been secretly supporting their marriage all along, making her entitled to continued support. The judge was not impressed with this logic. David moved back home with me temporarily while he sorted out his finances and his life. It was strange at first having my 40-year-old son sleeping in his childhood bedroom, eating breakfast at the same table where I had helped him with homework 30 years earlier. But it also gave us time to talk in a way we hadn't in years. "Dad," he said one morning over coffee, "I owe you an apology that I don't even know how to begin." I set down my newspaper and looked at my son. He looked older than his years, worn down by the stress of the divorce and the revelation of what his marriage had really been built on. "You don't owe me anything, David." "Yes, I do. I let Rebecca convince me that you needed my help. That you didn't understand how the modern world worked, that you were holding me back somehow." He shook his head. "I started seeing you through her eyes instead of my own." We talked for hours that morning about how subtle manipulation works, how gradually someone can change your perception of reality without you even realizing it's happening. David told me about conversations with Rebecca where she would plant seeds of doubt about my judgment, my relevance, my value to the family. "She made it seem like caring about you meant helping you change," he explained. "Like the loving thing to do was to modernize you, upgrade your lifestyle, teach you to present yourself better." I listened without judgment as my son worked through his guilt and confusion. I had spent months being angry about his behavior, but hearing him explain how carefully Rebecca had orchestrated his change in attitude toward me, I realized he had been as much a victim of her manipulation as I had been. The rest of our family took longer to understand what had really happened. Cousin Martha called me after she learned about Rebecca's illegal access to her bank records. "Michael, I don't know what to say. She told us all that you were struggling financially. She made it sound like you were too proud to ask for help, but that David was worried about you." Similar conversations happened with my nephew James, my sister-in-law Helen, and several other relatives. Rebecca had created an entire narrative about my circumstances, using illegally obtained information to make herself seem knowledgeable and concerned, while painting me as a declining elderly man who needed family intervention. The most painful conversation was with Sarah's sister Helen, who had apparently been planning to approach me about moving into a senior living facility, because Rebecca had told her I couldn't maintain my house properly anymore. "I feel like such a fool," Helen said when she called to apologize. "I should have talked to you directly instead of believing secondhand information." But the real transformation came in my relationship with David. Living together again, even temporarily, reminded both of us of what we had lost when Rebecca's influence took hold. We started working on home improvement projects together, the way we had when he was younger. We had long conversations about life, about values, about what really mattered. One evening, as we were refinishing the deck behind my house, David asked me about my wealth. "Dad, all those years when you and Mom were saving and investing, did you ever think about spending more on yourselves? You could have had anything you wanted." I stopped sanding the deck board I was working on and looked at my son. "David, your mother and I had everything we wanted. We had each other, we had you, we had our health and our home. What more could we need? But you could have traveled the world, bought luxury cars, lived in a mansion. And then what? Would that have made us happier? Would that have made you a better person? Would that have made our family stronger?" He thought about that for a while before answering. "Rebecca always said that success meant showing people what you could afford." "Rebecca was wrong about a lot of things," I replied gently. "Real success is having the freedom to live according to your values, not other people's expectations." 3 months ago, David found his own apartment across town. It's a modest place, well within his means, furnished simply but comfortably. He started dating again, a teacher named Jennifer who seems genuinely interested in who he is rather than what he owns. Last week he brought Jennifer over for dinner. She wore jeans and a sweater, helped with the dishes, and laughed at my stories about David's childhood mishaps. When she left that evening, she hugged me and said, "I can see where David gets his kindness. I've also made some changes in my life. Not to my lifestyle. I still drive my old truck and wear my comfortable clothes, but to my priorities. I've started volunteering at a local literacy program, helping adults learn to read. I've joined a woodworking club where I'm teaching younger members traditional crafting techniques. Most importantly, I've begun the process of establishing a foundation that will continue after I'm gone. The bulk of my wealth will support education and housing programs for working families, people who, like Sarah and I once were, are trying to build something better for their children. David will inherit enough to live comfortably and pursue his interests, but not so much that he'll never need to work or find his own purpose. We've talked about this extensively, and he understands my reasoning. I don't want to leave you a burden disguised as a blessing, I told him. I want to leave you the freedom to become whoever you're meant to be. Last month, I ran into Rebecca at the grocery store. She looked different. Older, harder somehow. Her clothes were still stylish, but I could see the strain around her eyes. She started to walk past me without acknowledgement, then stopped and turned back. "Michael," she said quietly, "I want you to know that I never meant for things to go as far as they did." I looked at this woman who had caused so much pain in my family, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Pity. "Rebecca, you spent 2 years studying my financial information illegally. You used that information to manipulate my family's perception of me. You publicly humiliated me to protect your own image. Those weren't mistakes or accidents. Those were choices." She looked down at her hands. "I know. I thought I was protecting David from being associated with failure. The only failure here was in understanding what actually matters in life." As I drove home that afternoon, I thought about the lessons this experience had taught me. About the difference between being respected and being feared. About the importance of knowing who people really are versus who they pretend to be. About the value of living authentically, even when others don't understand or appreciate your choices. Most of all, I learned that wealth without wisdom is meaningless, but wisdom without the courage to act on it is worthless. Tonight, David is coming over for dinner. We're going to plan a fishing trip, something we haven't done together in over 5 years. Jennifer might join us, though she's never been fishing before. I'm looking forward to teaching her. There's something peaceful about standing in a quiet stream, casting your line into the water, waiting patiently for what might come. It's a lot like life, really. You can't control what you'll catch, but you can control how you prepare, how you wait, and how you handle whatever comes your way. Rebecca taught me that some people will always judge you by your appearance, your possessions, your status in their social hierarchy. But she also taught me that those people reveal more about themselves than they ever do about you. I'm 63 years old, and I finally understand what my father meant when he told me, decades ago, that a man's true wealth isn't measured by what he owns, but by what he can walk away from without losing himself. I walked away from my family's false perceptions, from their misguided attempts to change me, from the pain of being misunderstood by the people I loved most, and in doing so, I found my way back to my son, to my values, and to a peace I hadn't felt in years. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. Sometimes it's simply refusing to become the person others want you to be.